Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now we're on to part two. Ed is the good cop, I'm the bad cop. And first and foremost, I want to thank the World Wildlife Fund for sponsoring this tour. It's rare that an organization will ask two journalists who are extremely passionate about two of the hot button topics in Canadian life, climate change and the tar sands, to engage Canadians. And we have had an incredible reception, and we find that ordinary Canadians are much more prepared to enter into a conversation about these two important developments, much more so than the leaders of this country. Now, my job is to talk about the tar sands, to give you a sense of the pace and scale of it, the political implications of this project, what it really means in terms of climate change, and also talk about some of the liabilities. And in many ways, you know, Ed has described how climate change has dramatically changed the landscape in the Arctic. Well, the rapid development of the tar sands has equally changed the political and economic landscape of Canada. Now, before we launch into this, I want to leave a thought from Ivan Illich, a Catholic theologian, who made this point back in 1973 in a marvelous book called Energy and Equity. And he said, high energy consumption degrades social relations just as it destroys the environment. And what he's really saying is that the more energy we consume in the form of hydrocarbons, the more this will distort our relationship among ourselves as people, and it also ultimately leads to greater and greater destruction of land and water. Now, the resource that is really reshaping Canada is immense. The tar sands are located in three major deposits in northern Alberta. They are the world's second largest hydrocarbon reserve on the planet after Saudi Arabia. And back in the 19th century, even the federal government regarded it as Canada's great reserve. So we've known about this resource for a long time, and we have always awaited the day when we would be able to exploit it and become extremely wealthy in the process. Now, these reserves are located in a very historic part of the country, along the Athabasca River. And at one time, this region was the center of the fur trade 400 years ago. And as recently as the 1920s, you could go on the Athabasca River and you could find traders from Syria with pots and pans, exchanging those pots and pans for beaver pelts and muskrat pelts and rabbit pelts along the river. So globalization is nothing new to the region, but pace and scale of it has changed dramatically. The other important thing is that this is where the country began. I mean, it's important to remember that Fort Chip, which is just 300 kilometers downstream from Fort McMurray, at one time in the 17th century had the largest library in all of Canada. But what this region was all about, it was about taking furs, exporting them to Europe so the Europeans could add value and create these incredible hats that were all the rage on the streets of Paris and London. And so this is the Canadian experience we're talking about. We're good at grabbing resources, whether they're white pine, whether they're cod, whether they're nickel, whether it's uranium, or now bitumen, sending it abroad, not necessarily adding lots of value, high-grading the resource often as quickly as we can. That is what we do as a people. And this story is really about our failure as a people to recognize what we do, why we do it, and why we have failed to move from the adolescent phase to adulthood as a nation. Now, of course, our interest in the Great Reserve, you know, you've got to bless the Americans. I dearly love them. I grew up in the United States. And here they are on the Athabasca River in the 1890s, on their way to the Klondike, taking the long way. And there were tens of thousands of Americans going to the gold rush And this got the Canadian government excited to no end. They said, oh my God, we haven't, signed treaties with Aboriginal people up there. They're going to find the Great Reserve, and they're going to cast, jealous eyes and envious eyes on it. So so they signed all these treaties, and they tried to wrap it up as quick as possible. And, the Americans, of course, were well armed, and as they tend to be whenever they travel abroad. But we responded to that threat, and we said, okay. And then by the 1930s, the resource had passed into the hands of the provincial government of Alberta. And here they are in 1932, they're saying, look, they're now calling it their magic sand pile. And, and here is a unique opportunity for industry, an opportunity and a challenge in the free land of free enterprise. The only problem is we hadn't yet found a way to economically exploit the resource. Now, here's the resource proper. It is called bitumen. Now, how many people here see oil floating on top of sand? This is why, as a journalist, I refuse, much to the consternation of my government and the oil industry, to call this resource oil sands. Oil sands makes you feel as though the resource is cheap, accessible, and that it's oil floating on top in sand, and that's completely deceitful. This resource doesn't do any of those things. In fact, Total calls it an extreme resource. Statoil, Norway's state company, calls it a difficult resource. And why? Because it's a hydrocarbon trapped in sand and clay, and it takes brute force to get it out of the ground, and it is a third-rate hydrocarbon. It was light oil 300 million years ago. Bacteria has degraded it, and now it's this tarry, gooey, mucky stuff that you can see in the picture. Nevertheless, politicians in Alberta refer to it now as the jewel of hydrocarbons. So the National Centre for Upgrading and Technology in Ottawa says, no, this stuff is like asphalt. It smells like asphalt, behaves like asphalt, even has been used to pave roads in Edmonton and Fort McMurray. You know what, guys? It's more than 50% pitch. So you know what? It really is tar. Another indication of the low quality of the resource, look at the yellow bar here. Here we're measuring gravity of hydrocarbons. This has one of the lowest gravity of any hydrocarbon. It will not move through a pipeline unless you dilute it with gasoline or natural gas condensate. Now, once you've got the bitumen out of the ground, you have to upgrade it. You've got to take some of the carbon molecules out and add hydrogen molecules to it, and then you get something called synthetic crude, and that synthetic crude requires complex refining because of all the acids and heavy metals, and it actually has 8 times more sulfur in it than West Texas crude or other light oils from the United States. So this resource requires enormous amounts of energy to upgrade, process, and refine. It's not the light oil your grandmother knew. Here's the last indication about the different nature of this resource is its energy intensity. It takes 1 barrel of oil to produce 3 barrels of oil for the steam plants in the tar sands, and that's where you're steaming the really deep deposits and melting them and bringing the bitumen up to surface. And so the 1 barrel gets you a return of 3. In the Middle East right now, the average is 1 barrel to 20. At the turn of the century, it was 1 barrel to 100. All right, so we're working our way down here. Our energy returns are becoming less and less and less. It's Mother Nature's way of saying, you know what, guys, you're running out of time. You have to make a transition. Now, here's what Charles Hall, one of the great experts on energy returned, on energy invested, really phenomenal scientist on the East Coast of the United States. This is what we need as a civilization to continue as business as usual. Well, the tar sands is already 2 barrels short. Another indication of the dirtiness of the resource, the National Energy Technology Lab in the United States tested a bunch of fuels that they were using to make diesel, and they looked at domestic crude and imported crude and bitumen from Venezuela and Canada, and lo and behold, a carbon footprint 244% greater than that of domestic crude oil. So is this a dirty product? You damn bet it is. The last indication of its difference is the fact that the capital intensity of this is 20% greater than, or 20 times greater than that of any other hydrocarbon on the planet at this point in time. This is one of the most expensive hydrocarbons. And Jeff Rubin, who is a fantastic public intellectual here in Toronto and has written a really, really great book about peak oil, has made the point repeatedly that, business as usual ends when you're running on fossil fuels that need a price of somewhere between 60 and 80 bucks a barrel. Now, the resource is so difficult to get out of the ground, the Albertans considered a shortcut in the 1960s. Somebody suggested, why don't you just set off a bomb under the Great Reserve and then we'll melt it all and then produce it to the surface. And the Alberta government said, that's a great idea. They took it to the United States. The United States, we have the bomb for you. And Atlantic Richfield said, we've got just the place. And fortunately, saner minds prevailed. The Russians, however, thought it was a fantastic idea. They exploded 3 nuclear warheads underneath their heavy oil deposits, only to discover, sadly, that there is yet no market for radioactive oil. So here we are. This is the kind of production that's going on in the tar sands. It's, it's big machines and shovel and truck operations. So that's what we arrived at as our solution for production. Just about every major oil company and every state-owned oil company is now in the tar sands. They know that this is close to the end of the game. If you want to stay in the oil business and don't want to become an energy company, you must go to this magic sandbox to play. It's significant that Shell, a third of its remaining oil reserves on the planet, are all in northern Alberta. Now, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce says, okay, well, with this project is going to power up prosperity. This is the brand new Hummer that's going to run the Canadian economy. We're going to become this powerhouse. Canadians are going to get rich, and the world is going to come to our doorstep. And I would suggest that maybe that's not the scenario that will play out. Now, what are some of the ice melting drivers really propelling this project forward? Well, the first is peak oil. And what is peak oil? Well, peak oil is basically, you've gone to the pub, you've ordered your beer, within 15 to 20 minutes, you're sadly staring depletion in the face and worrying about where you're going to get your next glass from. Unfortunately, this pub is about to close permanently, and what's left in this glass is of lower and lower quality. This is Colin Campbell, actually, a very famous geologist who worked in the oil patch for about 40 years. Now, here's what peak oil looks like in real life. What we're really talking about here is the end of cheap oil, of light oil, and we're looking at the depletion rates of light oil. This is from Norway, and this is what the curve looks like, and boom, you hit that point where half of everything that was there has been produced, and then you start declining. And Colin Campbell also points out that our perception of the world changed when we got hooked on hydrocarbons. It was the Viagra of the species. We're about 1 billion on the planet, and then kaboom, we find coal and oil, and we're off to the races. We are now 7 billion, and we're about to run out of this magic drug called oil. Well, actually, we're out to run out of the affordable light oil. Now, the second half of oil has now dawned and will be marked by the decline of oil and all that depends on it, including financial capital. And if you don't think the shock waves that we've seen in the financial communities around the world last year were not due to oil prices, I would encourage you to think again. When we hit $140 a barrel, the whole system started to shake. And why did it start to shake? Because it's all based on the premise that light oil and cheap oil will be there forever. It will not be. Mexico, as a petrostate for most of this century and a major oil supplier to the United States, is now in a rapid state of decline. It's on its way from a petrostate to a narco-state, judging by the headlines, and could soon become an oil importer. The United States, of course, is getting tired of bloody oil and of the high costs of it. They spend nearly $400 billion a year importing oil. Much of it has gone to Saudi Arabia. Much of that money, in turn, has gone to religious fanatics funding insurgencies against the United States. And so we've become the #1 supplier of oil to the U.S. We've done so without a political conversation, without a national debate. You cannot become the #1 supplier of oil to the world's mightiest empire, albeit a diminished empire, and not change everything about the character of who you are as a people. Most of the bitumen and synthetic crude now being produced in the tar sands is going directly to the U.S. Midwest. 70% of the oil running the U.S. Midwest comes from Canada. The majority of it from the tar sands, also a great deal of heavy oil from Saskatchewan. The goal is to make all of the United States dependent on this resource. We had salesmen who went down to the United States and said, look, Americans, we've got energy to burn. This is Ralph Klein, also known as King Ralph in Alberta. and where else in Canada are you going to have a premier called a king but in a petro state? And and Ralph said, we got energy to burn. He's never seen a pipeline he didn't like. And the Americans said, you know, sign this guy up before he gets sober. And we followed up with Murray Smith, who gave this rather remarkable speech in Austin, Texas. And he said, the model that works for us is that we give it away. So we own the resource, but we're giving it away. And this was a stunning pronouncement. And Murray was not kidding. He was absolutely correct. We did a royalty review, and this is what we found. Yes, we have among the lowest royalty rates in the world. We're at the bottom of the pond. We are indeed doing what we have always done as Canadians, give it away. And here we have the U.S. Council on Foreign Affairs confirming this very fact, saying, you know, this rapid development in the tar sands is driven by low royalty and tax rates. Canada's not getting its fair share, but Canadians don't seem to be concerned because they haven't even yet had a conversation about the development of this resource. And by the way, oh, you don't want to bring that up because, you know, the Albertans might get upset and all memories of the National Energy Board and, oh my God, we don't want to upset Albertans. And so we are changing the country. We have become this, you know, on a per capita basis, the largest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet. Kyoto obligations, you know, there's at the bottom there, 558. That's our target. And whoops, we missed it. And we missed it big time. And Kyoto wasn't the world's smartest agreement or the world's best agreement, but we made a commitment and we failed to honor it. And we are known around the world as a country now that does not honor its international promises. And we're wondering why we're becoming this target in the United States and in Europe, and I think it's only the beginning. We've had a massive labor migration from Atlantic Canada to the tar sands. 340,000 people have migrated there in the last 10 years to work as part of this boom, not just in Fort McMurray, but in related communities or related service industries. That's amazing. 7% of the population of Newfoundland. Almost everyone on the rock has a friend, a relative, or spouse working in some part of the oil patch. And yet you go there and you ask folks, well, you know what, we've got no energy security. This project is not about energy security for Canada. Atlantic Canada and Quebec are 100% dependent on oil from where? Oh, from the North Sea, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. Half the country is more dependent on foreign oil than the United States. Very Canadian situation. Here's the oil imports on a daily basis to Atlantic Canada from the Canadian Intelligence Agency, no less. Excuse me, the CIA in the United States, the Central Intelligence Agency. We don't have an intelligence agency. And so we have this petrodollar, which is kind of stunning. Our loonie goes up with the price of oil and comes down with the price of oil. And we've got Canadians kind of scratching their heads, what's going on? Well, our economy is now tied really to the production and export of one resource. The forestry industry knows it. They're getting hammered every time the dollar goes up by a cent. We're building these $30 billion worth of pipelines to the United States to take the resource down there. And we're not going to add value. In fact, a lot of this will be raw bitumen going to the United States to be upgraded and refined down there. And as a result, every time we export 500,000 barrels a day of this resource, we are exporting 18,000 jobs. That could be refining jobs, chemical upgrading jobs, you name it. Are we saving? Norway had a plan. Norway had a conversation about their oil wealth, and they said, you know what, the parties on the left, parties on the right, parties in between, you know, all agreed on one thing. If we don't do something about the wealth, it will destroy us as a country. So they took 90% off the table. They've had a pension fund or an oil fund now for 17 years. Its value is in excess of $330 billion, nearly $100,000 per every Norwegian. Stabilize their currency. They don't have a Dutch disease. They have a fully, highly functioning economy. Now here's what we've saved as a country. We have no sovereign fund. The largest benefactor of rapid tar sands development has been Ottawa. They make about $5 billion a year in corporate taxes, not royalties. The royalties are all in Alberta. And remember, we give it away kind of price there, and which kind of explains why the feds are making so much money. But the International Monetary Fund, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development have all said, Canada, save this money. You will not see it again. Oil is a finite resource. You are pissing it away. You are leaving no legacy for this country, no legacy for the next generation. And we are not. And not one single political party in this country has woken up to this issue, fundamental issue yet. Of course, I mean, I could go on and talk a lot about how the hydrocarbons have really distorted the political economy of Alberta. We're a dysfunctional petro, it's conveniently called overburden, and you dig. And these are among the world's largest open pit mines. And that truck you see there with the circle around it, that's a 400-ton truck. That's probably 2 stories high, in all likelihood driven by a woman, because you don't want an 18-year-old Alberta male handling $38 million of machinery. One of the issues we have, of course, are reclamation. We have industry and government saying, you know, they're experts at restoring boreal forest like this. And sorry, the experts didn't quite get it right. So, you know, a great deal of what we are doing up there, to put it simply, will be sacrificed. We cannot restore the original biological diversity that has been there, and we won't do it. The other form of production is the steam production, steam-assisted gravity drainage. You know, this is where you boil lots of water, mostly groundwater, and then convert it to steam and melt the bitumen like a big block of wax and bring it up to surface. An incredibly energy-intensive process. This consumes enormous amounts of natural gas to boil this water. And this is you know, the really big source of greenhouse gases in the tar sands. So let's go to the North Sea. And what on average are they producing there with best practices? These are the Norwegians again, right? 9 kilograms to 18 kilograms per barrel in terms of greenhouse gases per barrel of oil from the North Sea. So what are we getting from the tar sands? Well, we've got an enormous range, everywhere from 22 kilograms to 417 kilograms per barrel. Now, there's a great study done here at the University of Toronto by Heather McLean, and that looked at the whole issue of transparency and carbon reporting in the country, that essentially concluded, you know what, we're not doing a very good job here. There is very little transparency. The companies are not giving us real numbers with which to actually calculate what is the real carbon footprint of this project. Another issue, a very significant one, has to do with land fragmentation. This is from the Pembina Institute. This shows what development for the steam plants, lots of pipelines, lots of roads, what that will look like over time in the forest. That signs a death warrant for woodland caribou and boreal songbirds over an enormous region. And in real terms, we're looking at industrializing, at this point in time, 14 million hectares. That's 20 Calgarys, 40 Denvers, 17 Berlins. The water issues are incredibly significant. It takes 12 barrels of fresh water to produce 1 barrel of bitumen. You're using all that water in a kind of hot water process, a big washing machine, adding caustic ingredients, separating the bitumen from the sand and the clay, and then you have this wastewater. So for every 12 barrels, you're creating 3 barrels that end up in tailings ponds as waste. Every day, you're producing about 1.8 billion liters. And this stuff contains ammonia, chlorides, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, cyanide, naphthenic acids. These tailings ponds now occupy 130 square kilometers. They are all unlined, they are all leaking, and there's no transparency about how much is seeping either into the Athabasca River or into groundwater. This is the Tar Island Dike. It has been leaking, and this has been documented, into the Athabasca River for 30 years. And you can see why. The river has actually eroded the toe of this dike. And then, of course, you've got these open bodies of water. Birds want to land on them, take a bath. They get covered in bitumen, sink to the bottom, and you have canard bitumen. And another issue that is extremely important is that of air pollution. And the tar sands is producing an enormous amount of sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides, all the ingredients for acid rain. 12% of the forest soils in northern Alberta are now acidifying on a rapid basis. And we have acid rain now falling in La Loche and other lakes in northern Saskatchewan with the acidity of coffee. So we're creating an acid rain problem where one never existed. The carbon issues, immense, 36 million tons a year from the tar sands alone. This is a carbon-making nation within the nation. You're saying, okay, 36 million tons, what's a ton? Well, 1 ton of greenhouse gases or CO2 will fill 2 average-sized homes. So we're filling up 76 million homes a year with greenhouse gases. Another way to look at it, okay, well, let's take a look at countries in Europe. What are they producing on an annual basis? Estonia, 22 million tons, so more than Estonia. Belgium soon will be up to 131 million tons by 2020, so we'll be producing as many greenhouse gases in the tar sands as a nation, a European nation of 10 million people. And then we wonder why the Europeans are getting excited about this. Utah, 32 million tons, so more than Utah, which is an energy-producing state. 127 million tons, more than Florida by the end of 2020. 124 million tons in Ohio. What's our solution? Well, we're going to capture all this carbon. Right, we're going to stick it under the ground. And I sort of compare this. Now, I mean, this is the kind of solution that a serial killer comes up with. You've got a problem, you've got a bunch of bodies on the floor, and you figure, okay, what the heck? All right, if I want to stay in business, I got to bury some of these bodies, right? Otherwise, someone's going to notice that something bad is happening here. And this is kind of our knee-jerk reaction, because we don't have a plan B, we don't have a climate change program, we don't have an energy plan in this country, so this is our knee-jerk reaction. We're going to bury this stuff. And it's largely an unproven science experiment. We can't really do it on any critical scale, and the economics of it are absolutely foolhardy. The Economist thinks this whole thing is a really, really bad idea, and this is that really conservative business journal. We have the World Wildlife Fund came up with a very brilliant report saying basically the same thing. This is not a smart idea. Not only that, it will not work in the tar sands. There is no serious ability to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions anytime this side of 2050 in this project using this unproven technology. And then you have Greenpeace, this really radical environmental group saying this is a really bad idea too. So, you've got conservatives, you've got people in the middle, and you've got people on the other extreme, all agreeing and all suggesting that this is the wrong solution for the problem, which seems to indicate that they're probably right and the Canadian government is wrong. Now, a few last things here. These are the kinds of ads we are now running in the United States that the American industry and Canadian industry and Canadian government are pushing, that women and children will be without energy unless we rapidly develop the tar sands. We have a prime minister who is the son of an imperial oil executive and very much a climate change skeptic. In fact, I would go so far, he really is a climate change denier. I mean, a lot of his friends are members of the Friends of Science in Calgary, and he doesn't think this is an issue. All right? So this is a man whose perspective on this globally significant event is very similar to that of George Bush's, and yet, God forbid, if anybody in the media mentions it. You're not allowed to mention it. No, you can't say that. Yet that's who he is. We have Michael Ignatieff of the Liberals basically saying the same sort of thing that Harper is saying. And what are these two gentlemen really saying in the end? What they're saying is that resource politics is what drives the country, and as political parties, we're interested in getting our hands on this money because there's no accountability, and it will make it easier for both of us to run the country. We've got a different perspective south of the border. Here's Barack Obama, not talking about tar sands, but just talking about oil in general, recognizing, you know what, we need to get off this stuff. If the American empire is going to continue, it needs to get off this resource. We have another politician in California saying, low carbon fuels, that's what we want. Canadian government went bananas when Schwarzenegger said this. They sent letters saying, you can't do this is wrong. This is, and Arnold said, no, we can and we will do this. This is the right way to go. The US military is also beginning to think the same way. They are the number one consumer of fuels on the continent. Okay? Number one consumer of petroleum products. They had an epiphany in Iraq. 10% of their fighting forces were in the front. The tanks, the Humvees, the guys all engaged in frontline combat. Another 90% were supplying them with diesel. And what they learned was how vulnerable that 90% supply chain truly was to improvised explosive devices and attacks by insurgents. And they realized, man, we've got a problem. They were losing lots of men, and 50 to 60% of the fuel supplies never got where they needed to be. And so what did they do? Well, they started to think green. They said, what do we do with that outpost? Well, my God, we'll have solar power, and we'll have wind power, and whatever is excess, we're going to give it to the local community. We'll insulate our tents. By the way, they provide air conditioning for tents in Iraq for the soldiers because it's so damn hot. And so they insulated their tents to cut down on the amount of energy needed to keep them cool, and they reduced the amount of fossil fuels that were needed to supply outposts by 50%. And they reduced casualties at the same time. Now they've come back to the United States, and we're talking about admirals, colonels, generals in all three military armed forces saying, you know what, we need to do this right across the board. The largest solar array going up in the United States is outside of a U.S. military base. Many of the largest installations in the United States running on geothermal are U.S. military bases. And here's what they're saying. U.S. dependence on fossil fuels undermines economic stability, which is critical to national security. Oh, they're not talking about bloody oil. They're not talking about dirty oil. They're talking about oil, period. The Director of Air Warfare, Dennis McGuinn, has made exactly the same argument to the U.S. Congress. And here's the last thing. Deutsche Bank, very well known, very prominent bank in Europe, has said, you know what? I don't think the future for heavy oils like stuff in the tar sands is going to last very long, and here's why. Every time oil spikes and goes up to 140, 175, 200, whatever the next spike will be, a lot of people are going to say, whoa, I can't run my business on a product this volatile. And you know what? It's time for me to get off of it. And the Deutsche Bank thinks it's not the fact that we're going to run out of oil, it's the fact that we can no longer run an economy on a product this volatile that's going to get us off of it. And so they predict by 2016, and who knows if they're right or wrong, that we're going to see falling oil prices, and we're going to see the value of projects like the tar sands diminish over time. And so this will not be the Canadian project. This will not be the driver of our future economy. We'll see disruptive technology, such as electric cars, come along. We are not quite there yet with really smart batteries, but they're coming. Consumers will be reluctant to switch back because of the price volatility. That's according to the Deutsche Bank. We've seen this happen before. In the 19th century, we ran on whale oil, and along came kerosene, and then we saw this spike and a complete decline in whale oil, and we switched over to kerosene. So when change happens, it happens rapidly. So where do we go? Well, I think we need the advice of St. Francis of Assisi, you know, the great first green Catholic saint. Probably wasn't the first green guy, but anyway, start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible, and suddenly you are doing the impossible. And so we need to follow the advice of people like Peter Lougheed, former Premier of Alberta, who says, slow down, one project at a time. What's the rush? If your car has brakes, use the brakes. Relocalize food production. Here's the easiest way for everyone in this room to begin to lower their carbon footprint and prepare for the future, and prepare for a much more resilient economy, one that doesn't depend on moving food thousands and thousands of kilometers. A no-brainer, a national carbon tax. If there's a bad behavior out there and you want to get rid of it, start taxing it. And you don't have to tax the hell out of it, make it progressive over time. And we are all part of this problem. This is not an issue for oil companies. This is an issue for oil consumers. We are all oil consumers. Take the money off the table. If we don't take the money off the table, our government will represent the resource. It will not represent Canadians. And only when the government runs on our taxes will it represent us. Otherwise, it will represent the resource. National carbon budget. Don't start a project like this unless you have a plan to take 2 kilograms off the table for every kilogram of carbon produced in the tar sands. Hard targets for renewable energy. Right now, all of our companies, leaders in solar and wind, are operating south of the border or in Europe because they're not welcome here. Thou shalt not steal. Effective climate action now. The time for half measures is over. We cannot steal anymore from future generations. Our strategy is we'll do what the Americans are going to do when the Americans come up with the plan. What we haven't prepared for is what if the Americans come up with a plan that puts a high price on carbon that really kills demand in the tar sands? What are we going to do then? And so now we are stuck in the sand. We don't have to be there. And I would suggest that with healthy debate around this country, we can go to better places, and we need to do that yesterday. Thank you.